Step down slow. Hey, with this deputy right here, okay?
Archie Williams walked into that courtroom as a young man with a future that still had time to unfold. And the moment the judge began to speak, the air in the room shifted, because the words that followed were not just a verdict, but a sentence that would become a permanent mark on his identity. And by the time the sentence was finished, Archie would be defined by a crime the state claimed he committed. And the question that would haunt his life was what happens to a boy when the system decides his story is already written. The sentence was read calmly, without theatrics, but the impact was immediate. And the young man who had once been just a voice in church choirs and a face in his community was suddenly labeled a murderer and a rapist, a label that would follow him into the darkest places of the prison system and into a future that no longer belonged to him. The crime that brought Archie Williams into the spotlight was violent enough to demand answers quickly, a brutal assault that shook a neighborhood and left the community demanding justice. And when law enforcement began its investigation, the pressure to deliver a suspect was already building. Because in situations like this, uncertainty feels like failure, and failure is not tolerated in the world of criminal justice. Archie's name surfaced in that chaos, not because the evidence was clear, but because he was a young man who fit the shape of a suspect. And once the narrative began to form, it was difficult to stop because the system had already decided it needed an ending. And endings are easier when the accused is already in place. Witness statements were collected, timelines were constructed, and the investigation moved forward with the momentum of a story that was already being told. And in that environment, doubts were treated as distractions rather than reasons to pause. The trial moved quickly, faster than the kind of careful investigation that would have required advanced forensic tools, because DNA testing was not widely available and the technology of the time was limited. And the prosecution relied on testimony that sounded confident enough to convince a jury that they had found the right man. Archie Williams insisted he was innocent, but his voice was drowned out by the momentum of the case, and the system continued to build its narrative as if the truth was already known. When the verdict was delivered, it was accepted as the final answer, and Archie was sentenced to life without parole, a punishment that meant the state expected him to disappear, to become just another number in a prison designed to erase people rather than correct them. The first years inside prison were brutal in the way that time can be brutal, not because of violence alone, but because of the slow erosion of identity, the way a person can begin to believe the label assigned to them, because the world outside no longer sees them as anything else. Archie Williams was sent to Angola prison, where the walls are thick and the days are long, and the sentence was not just a punishment, but a complete removal of possibility, because life without parole is a sentence that does not allow for growth, change, or redemption. And it is a sentence that assumes guilt without leaving room for doubt. In the years that followed, Archie filed appeals and maintained his innocence. But the system did not move, because the conviction had become a fixed story, and fixed stories are rarely questioned once they are accepted. As decades passed, the world outside changed dramatically. Technology advanced, and DNA testing became a standard tool in criminal investigations. But Archie's case remained untouched, because the state had no incentive to revisit a conviction it had already declared final. The prison system continued to operate under the assumption that the verdict was correct, and Archie's name remained in the record as a criminal rather than as a man whose life had been taken. The longer the conviction stood, the more difficult it became to imagine that the state could be wrong, because the system is designed to defend itself, and defending itself often means refusing to admit error. Then, after decades of silence, the case was reopened. Not because the state suddenly felt remorse, but because organizations dedicated to uncovering wrongful convictions began to review old cases, and Archie Williams' case fit a pattern that demanded attention. When the Innocence Project took on the file, they did not do it for drama or for headlines. They did it because the details of the case raised serious questions, and because they knew that in many wrongful convictions, the truth is hidden in the details that were ignored the first time around. The evidence was re-examined, old records were reviewed, and for the first time in decades, the case was treated as something that might have been wrong rather than something that was simply finished. The breakthrough came when DNA testing was finally applied to preserved evidence from the original investigation, and the results were not just surprising, they were devastating to the state's narrative. The DNA did not match Archie Williams, and it never had. which meant the entire conviction was built on a story that did not align with the scientific truth. The evidence that had been used to convict him was exposed as a foundation built on assumption rather than proof, and the state could no longer defend the sentence without admitting that it had been wrong. In 2019, Archie Williams was released from prison after more than 36 years behind bars, and the exoneration was not a celebration so much as a quiet correction, because the truth arrived too late to undo the decades he had lost. Freedom did not restore the years that had been taken, and it did not erase the damage, because a life that has been stolen cannot be returned, and the world outside had changed in ways Archie could not have imagined while he was locked away. He stepped into a society shaped by technology and social media, and his story was soon shared across platforms. But the public reaction was not simple, because the story of a wrongful conviction does not fit neatly into the kind of narratives people prefer. When Archie Williams appeared on America's Got Talent, he was not introduced as a victim of injustice. He was introduced as a performer, and his voice became the proof that he had survived a system that was supposed to protect him. Millions watched his performance, and the shock of his story spread fast, because the truth was too startling to ignore, and because the idea that the justice system could be wrong for so long was frightening. But as the story spread, misinformation began to circulate just as quickly, because the internet thrives on drama, and drama does not always care about accuracy. Some posts repeated the original accusation without clarifying the exoneration, and the same label that had haunted Archie for decades continued to appear online, even after the truth had been revealed. The speed of social media turned his story into a battleground, where truth and sensationalism fought for attention, and the public was left trying to separate what was real from what was shared for shock value. The same system that had once convicted him without definitive proof was now being judged in the court of public opinion, and the consequences of that original conviction were still unfolding. What makes Archie Williams' case feel like a thriller is not the crime itself, but the way the system operated, because the real danger is how easily a narrative can be constructed and defended when people are under pressure to deliver results. The state built a version of events that fit the need for closure, and that version was supported by confident testimony and a community desperate for certainty. And the system treated that version as truth for decades, even when the evidence did not support it. The exoneration exposed the fragility of certainty, and it showed how quickly a life can be destroyed when the truth is not considered essential to the process. The collapse of the official story was not dramatic, it was procedural, but it was devastating because it revealed the reality behind the label of guilt, and it forced the public to confront the fact that the system can be wrong for a long time without anyone being held accountable. The conviction that had once been treated as final was now exposed as a mistake, and the state had to face the consequences of its own certainty, not just for Archie Williams, but for the idea that justice is always accurate. Archie Williams' story is not a simple tale of redemption, because there was no redemption available for the years he lost, and there was no way to reclaim the life that was taken from him. But it is a warning, a mirror held up to a system that can be manipulated by fear, pressure, and the desire for quick answers. Truth finally caught up, but it took decades, and the cost was a human life, measured not in years, but in stolen time. Share this story and let people know the truth about Archie Williams. Subscribe for more stories that expose what the system doesn't want you to see.